The United States is again talking about a possible Zelensky-Putin meeting within weeks. But this is exactly the kind of diplomacy that is announced loudly and almost never happens. Because the very idea of such a meeting contradicts the current reality of the war. US envoy Steve Witkoff says American proposals could lead to direct talks between Kyiv and Moscow and even a trilateral summit involving Donald Trump. Yet the key conditions set by Washington effectively make such a meeting impossible. Trump does not want to sit down unless a deal is already in sight. And no deal is in sight. The positions of the two sides remain mutually exclusive. Russia demands territory, neutrality, and strategic weakening of Ukraine. Ukraine refuses to trade land, people, or sovereignty. This is not a gap in details. This is a clash of war aims. Even Witkoff acknowledges that negotiations are blocked on the territorial issue itself. That is the Kremlin's core demand and Kyiv's core red line. Under these conditions, a leaders' meeting would not unlock peace. It would simply stage a deadlock in front of cameras. So why is Washington again promoting a summit that is almost certain not to happen? In reality, it functions as a political instrument of pressure and signaling. The United States shows diplomatic activity to its own audience while signaling to both Moscow and Kyiv that it wants a rapid political outcome. But a rapid outcome in this war is only possible through concessions. And everyone understands from whom they are expected. Kyiv has repeatedly argued that Russia uses talks of negotiations as a delaying tactic and as a way to impose its terms without changing realities on the battlefield. In that context, summit rhetoric now looks less like preparing peace and more like preparing leverage. The central issue is not whether Zelensky and Putin will meet. It is why the West keeps advancing a format that cannot work without Ukrainian concessions. Territorial concessions in this war are not about land, they are about people. For Ukraine, any withdrawal from occupied regions would mean abandoning millions of citizens, weakening national positions, and risking deep internal division. In a new interview in Kyiv, President Zelensky made clear that Ukraine will not trade territory for a ceasefire demanded by Russia. He said to BBC that any pause achieved through concessions would only give Moscow time to rebuild and resume aggression within a few years. Kyiv's position remains that restoring Ukraine's internationally recognized borders is both a strategic objective and a matter of justice, but one that must be achieved without catastrophic human losses and with sufficient military capability. Zelensky framed that war as far larger than regional conflict. He argued that Russia's invasion is an attempt to impose its model of power beyond Ukraine and reshape the global order, meaning the outcome in Ukraine will determine security across Europe and beyond. He also pushed back against persistent narratives in parts of the West that Ukraine cannot win and must accept territorial loss. The continued functioning of the Ukrainian state and capital under full-scale invasion, he argued, is itself evidence that defeat is not inevitable. At the same time, Kyiv acknowledges the limits shaping the battlefield. The pace of territorial recovery depends heavily on Western weapons, especially air defense and missile systems. Ukraine continues to seek permission to produce some US-designed systems domestically, but approvals remain pending. For Zelensky, the stake therefore extends beyond Ukraine itself, to the scale and nature of the war Russia is waging. He argues that what is unfolding is not simply a regional invasion, but the opening phase of a much wider confrontation driven by Moscow's attempt to reshape how societies live and choose their future.
There are different views on what constitutes a third world war. I believe Putin has already started it. The question is how much territory he will be able to seize and how to stop him. Not simply so that Russia does not win, but because Russia wants to impose its own world and change the way people live, the way they themselves have chosen to live. That is why I believe, and have long believed, that Putin has already begun this war. And we are stopping him from expanding it into a broader, full-scale global conflict, a third world war. Today, We are the outpost. We are holding Putin back.
Ukraine is facing pressure not only from Moscow, but from within the European Union itself. Hungary and Slovakia have escalated threats against Kyiv over the suspension of Russian oil transit through the Druzhba pipeline, a route that was disrupted after a Russian strike damaged infrastructure on Ukrainian territory in late January. Despite the fact that the disruption was caused by Russian attacks, both Budapest and Bratislava have chosen to blame Ukraine and to link energy pressure directly to political concessions. Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico warned he was ready to halt emergency electricity supplies to Ukraine starting from February 23rd, unless oil transit resumes. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán echoed the ultimatum the same day. While Hungary later stepped back from the immediate electricity threat, Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó claimed the decision was related to alleged risks facing ethnic Hungarians in Ukraine, a justification Kyiv views as a politically motivated. But the broader pressure campaign remains. Orbán has threatened to block EU financial assistance to Ukraine, suspend diesel exports, and veto the European Union's 20th sanctions package against Russia, which he did. The threats comes as Russia intensifies missiles and drone attacks across Ukraine and seeks to fracture European unity ahead of renewed diplomatic maneuvering over the war.
The 20th package of sanctions is planned to be adopted tomorrow at the foreign ministers' meeting. We will block this decision tomorrow. We will not allow the adoption of the 20th package of sanctions because we have previously made it clear that until the Ukrainians resume oil shipments to Hungary, we will not allow decisions that are important to them to be approved. So tomorrow, at the foreign ministers' meeting, Hungary will block the adoption of the 20th package of sanctions.
European leaders are openly expressing shock at Hungary's stance on Ukraine and Russia. In Brussels, German foreign minister said Berlin is astonished by Budapest's actions and warned it is wrong if Hungary effectively betrays its own historic struggle for freedom and European sovereignty. He stressed that Europe must show strength and increase pressure on Russia, and that work on the EU's 20 sanctions package is ongoing and should ultimately succeed. He also cautioned that repeated offers of talks to Moscow risk reinforcing the Kremlin's belief that greater stubbornness brings greater concessions. Officials in Brussels say the sanctions package will eventually pass, but Budapest and Bratislava are systematically slowing the process in an effort to extract energy concessions.
Ich bin über die ungarische Position erstaunt. Wir werden mit unseren ungarischen Kollegen darüber diskutieren. Ich glaube nicht, dass es richtig ist, wenn Ungarn seinen eigenen Kampf für die Freiheit, für die europäische Souveränität verrät. Und deswegen werden wir hier auch mit unseren Argumenten noch einmal in Budapest, aber auch natürlich hier in Brüssel an die Ungarn herantreten, dass man die Position überdenkt.
That's it. Donald Trump is no longer advantageous to dictator Putin, the New York Times writes. At the start of the full-scale invasion, the Kremlin believed a rapid victory over Ukraine would force the United States to accept new Russian spheres of influence in Europe. Trump, who at the time signaled a desire to distance himself from Ukraine's war, appeared to Moscow as a potentially convenient partner. But Russia miscalculated, the paper argues. Despite publicly warm contacts and symbolic gestures, no real rapprochement between Washington and Moscow followed. Diplomatic channels were not restored, no breakthroughs materialized. Most importantly, Trump has consistently ignored the Kremlin's core objective: recognition of Russia as an equal great power entitled to dominate its neighborhood. He rejected Putin's offer of mediation after US strike on Iran, excluded him from Middle East diplomacy, and openly intervened in the Caucasus, a region Moscow considered its sphere of influence. At the same time, the United States acted directly against Russian economic interests, sanctions on Russian oil, pressure on India to curb purchases, and seizure of tankers sailing under the Russian flag. Even on nuclear arms control, Trump denied Moscow the status it seeks. He signaled that any future agreement must include China, shifting the format away from the bilateral US-Russia parity the Kremlin wants. And even when inviting Russia into new international frameworks, Trump offered no equality. In his proposed Peace Council, he declared himself lifelong chair, a role that places Moscow in a subordinate position rather than a partnership of equals. Yes, Trump and Putin share certain ideological overlaps: skepticism toward the EU, hostility to liberal norms, belief in power politics. But strategically, Trump is not acting as Moscow's ally, the article concludes. He behaves as a leader, unwilling to recognize Russia as an equal or divide the world into spheres of influence with the Kremlin. Europe's eastern flank is already preparing for the possibility of a major war with Russia, and doing so far faster than the rest of the continent. 4 years into the invasion of Ukraine, it is the states that feel the Russian threat most directly that are rapidly expanding defense, investing in long-range strike capabilities, and fortifying their borders. Finland, the Baltic states, and Poland are effectively moving into a permanent readiness posture, built on the understanding that deterrence only works if Moscow knows any war would immediately reach Russian territory as well. That is why these countries are investing not only in defense, but in the ability to strike deep into Russia. They are also building mobilization systems and territorial forces far larger than Western perceptions often assume. At the same time, a new European security reality is taking shape. If the United States reduces its role, the continent's defense will increasingly rely on coalitions of the states that treat the Russian threat as existential. Western Europe is moving more slowly, and confidence that all allies would fight Russia in a crisis remains uncertain. As a result, Europe's east and north are becoming the core of deterrence. The conclusion emerging even more clearly is that these frontline states are neither helpless nor passive. They are systematically preparing for the scenario of a direct confrontation with Russia should it come. That's all for now. For more content, please subscribe.